The last pieces of furniture were being placed in Princess Pauline's apartments when the frigate bringing her was announced. The emperor went down to the harbor to wait for her. He had been strolling there for a moment when he thought he recognized a gendarmerie sergeant placed there to keep away the crowd that was anxious to see him. The emperor went up to him and asked if he wasn't a Corsican. Yes, sire. From where? Boccognano, sire. What's your name? Marcaggi. The name was familiar to the emperor. During the Corsican civil wars, he had been arrested in that vicinity by brigands and locked up in a room. A young man named Marcaggi from Boccognano offered to rescue him and accompany him until he was out of danger. The emperor remembered that favor and even recalled it in St. Helena in one of his conscience bequests. He continued to chat with the sergeant who showed him two of his very young children. The emperor gave them each 2 Napoleons to buy pastries. Once back in France, the emperor made him a lieutenant. This soldier, forgotten on the island where he had been for so long, had a good service record. He awarded him with the Cross of the Legion of Honor and promised to take care of his children as soon as they reached high school age. When the frigate had dropped anchor, the emperor went out in his gig to meet the princess, brought her back to shore, and drove her in his carriage to Madame's. She then came to take possession of the apartment the emperor had prepared for her. She was very thankful and happy about it. That same day, the emperor, overseeing the installation of furniture in the princess's apartment, burned his fingers badly on a small dish where aloe was burning. Without paying attention, the emperor had wanted to move it away from in front of a marble bust. As an inkwell was handy, he dipped his fingers in it without complaining of having felt the slightest pain. His fingers healed without his having said anything. I was more saddened by this accident, as it was I who had placed that burner there, and the emperor was moving it only to reply to the Grand Marshal. He was contemplating the Canova bust of himself. What he reproached the artist for in that statue was the athletic figure he had been given, as if it had been his arm that had won battles instead of the use of his head. It's funny. Princess Pauline's arrival initiated a new way of life in Portofrejo. Parties, balls, and concerts were given at her house. Evening receptions were held at the emperor's and at Madame's, replacing the activities of all kinds that had taken place until 10. The small court of the sovereign of Elba took on a less military look. The princess, whose every charm was at its peak, lent an air of gallantry and mirth to all who surrounded her. The emperor was quite right in naming his 2 sisters, the Queen of Naples, and even more so Princess Pauline, whose beauty was more austere, as the 2 prettiest women of his court in France. Nothing was as perfectly beautiful as this princess. It could be said that, in creating her, nature had borrowed from Praxiteles those points with which he determined the perfect shape of his Venus, for her beauty was that remarkable. She had brought her retinue, taking as ladies' companions Madame Colombani and Madame Bellini, wives of senior officers, and Mademoiselle Lebel, daughter of the adjutant general by that name. All 3 had a remarkable appearance and distinction. The princess dined every day with the emperor and General Drouot. She had herself transported from her apartments to the emperor's. She went on her excursions in a sedan chair. In preference to a carriage, she was always accompanied by officers of the guard who all vied for that honor. The Sunday invitations for dinner continued. It happened at one of these dinners that Countess Bertrand, who was not always on time, entered the dining room when the emperor was already seated. She had forced people to wait for her and wanted to apologize, but the emperor, knowing her weakness, said to her, "Madame, it is neither appropriate nor polite to make people wait for you." Saint-Denis, who was serving the emperor, told me that those words were spoken in a rather curt manner. She had been quite taken aback, and the handkerchief she used attested to the tears in her eyes. Pauline hastened to soften the impact on her feelings by asking news of her charming children. During that dinner, the emperor announced that twice he owed his life to the fact that he measured only 5'6". Some 40 Polish cavalrymen, sent by the emperor to the empress in Parma under the command of Major Belinsky, landed in Portofrejo. The Austrian government had not wanted them to remain with this princess. The emperor received them on the castle terrace, and they were quartered in the Étoile fort. A few days later, after she had settled in, the princess was kind enough to send for me. She handed me a letter from my mother, and the emperor was present. The nights when he went to bed, he asked me what she had written. I told him she gave news of the empress and the king of Rome, who was very much liked by the Austrian emperor, and that a few days ago, when he got cross with her, he told her he would send her to take care of Louis XVIII. She also said that while the prince was very busy one day observing troops parading under his window, the empress went near him and asked him if he thought those soldiers were as fine as French soldiers. He replied, "No. If they were French, they would salute me." She told me that the empress was going to Aix for the baths to restore her health, which was much affected by recent events, and told me her wish that the empress would go to Parma so that I could come and see her there. During this trip, the King of Rome remained in the care of Countess Montesquieu and my mother, who wrote to me morning and night. She made sure that the emperor's name was mentioned in the prince's prayers. Several of these details made the emperor laugh and pleased him. That evening, they were repeated in the salon. Princess Pauline said at this point that she had been told that in Vienna, when the Prince de Ligne had been introduced to the King of Rome, he had asked his governess if this was one of the marshals who had betrayed his father. When he received a negative answer, he had then held out his hand. The emperor used the most flattering words when speaking of Countess Montesquieu. As I was retiring, he said to me, "Doesn't she mention Meneval?" He expected to learn from this faithful aide the contents of the secret resolutions reached at the Congress of Vienna. It wasn't long before he had news. Through this correspondence, the emperor was able to follow the empress's trip to Switzerland, as well as the side trips that took her to see King Joseph in Prangan. It was on her return from seeing this prince that she found in Aix Count Neipperg, who was coming on orders of the Austrian emperor to join her household as chamberlain, but in fact to spy on that princess's moves and oppose any attempt that might suggest to her the thought of going to Elba. Had she come to this residence, she would have found portraits of herself and the King of Rome hanging in the emperor's bedroom. Tuna fishing takes place twice a year in Elba. It is an island celebration that starts with a sort of ritual. The men who carry out this fishing, which produces much revenue for the sovereign's estate, are required by treaty to sell the islanders 1/4 of their catch at a very low cost. The autumn fishing was off to a good start. It began at daybreak. A large number of boats crisscrossed the roadsteads where the fishing was taking place. All eyes were on the enormous net. Fishermen were harpooning the fish that surfaced. The waters were soon reddened by their blood. When the tuna lose their strength, they are gathered and taken ashore. The emperor went out to harpoon a few and came back from this activity covered with salt water and a few drops of blood. The fishing that year was most abundant. In spite of the resources brought about by the emperor's constructions on the island, the residents of Capoliervi refused to pay their taxes when the tax collector came to their homes. The emperor criticized at great length the gendarmerie lieutenant in charge of the collection, who had just told him about this minor rebellion. He said to him, "Go tell them that if they haven't paid within 24 hours, I will send a battalion to lodge and eat in their homes." This refusal by a rich parish was setting a bad example, and this first mutiny had to be repressed vigorously. The taxes were paid. Chapter 5. Officers and travelers, or tradesmen, arriving from France, Italy, and Corsica gave His Majesty an exact idea of France's position and the general discontent caused by the new government. People feared for the emperor's person. News arriving from Vienna via Livorno and Naples was not reassuring. Tradesmen from Genoa and Lyon, knowing that the emperor's and his family's pensions were not being paid, offered him money. There was talk of St. Helena. The emperor thus decided to send back to the continent, to Genoa, Captain Lubers of the Guard, who had gone there before with Cipriani, one of his butlers. Cipriani, a trusted aide of Salicetti. The police ministers in Naples knew many of the people in Genoa and Vienna and had previously seen in Naples, with whom he had established contact during his first trip. Captain Luberis had a sensitive mission and carried it off with tact and success. The brig arrived in the Genoa harbor under the pretext, as in the past, of buying things necessary for the battalion and some furniture and crystal for the palace. Letters from the emperor to the empress were sent and received, and the replies arrived in Elba. Intelligence contacts were established in that city, and offers of money and devotion to the emperor were made to Captain Luberis. Cipriani's mission was to find out through persons whose names had been given to him what was going on in diplomatic circles in the capital and in the Congress itself, to watch for the departure of any sovereigns gathered there, and to immediately so inform the emperor, and to establish in Genoa with his friends a news network that would send the emperor a bulletin each week on affairs in Vienna. He soon reported that the Congress was talking about the danger of having Napoleon so close to the coasts of Italy and France, and of the need to move him further away, the name of St. Helena having been mentioned. The emperor couldn't believe it, but this was confirmed by another source, and a copy of the secret resolution on this subject was provided. Newspapers were openly talking about this plan. True or false, this information brought back by the brig forced the emperor to take certain precautions. Navy Commander Chotar was ordered to keep a vigilant watch on the navigation of ships cruising near Elba. British newspapers coming from Livorno gave a confirmation of sorts of the news brought back by the brig. The emperor, on receiving this first news, said, "I do not believe that Europe wishes to take up arms against me. I would, however, not suggest that they attack me here. They could pay dearly for their endeavor. I have 6 months' provisions, good artillery, and brave soldiers to defend me. I was guaranteed the sovereignty of Elba. I am at home here, and I do not advise anyone to come and disturb me." Some defense measures were decided on for the outer gates. The emperor ordered the British fort armed, as it was separated from the stronghold's fortification system. One day, when he was having a well dug at the foot of the fort, a child of some dozen years came up to him and was looking at him carefully, a happy look on his face. The emperor asked him in Italian why he was there. "I came to see you. They say you are the Emperor Napoleon. Is it true? But what are you doing?" "I am tending my goats. Are they yours?" "No, they are my master's." "Are you pleased with him?" "Not too pleased. He is rich and gives me little." "Would you be happy to have another job?" "Yes, if it was with a good master." "Well, come to town tomorrow and ask for the Grand Marshal. He will find you a good job. Bertrand, send him to Chauvin. He will put him in the stables." That same evening, the little goat herd turned the goats over to his master, did not complain about him, and asked for his blessing, which he gave more readily than the small amount of money he owed him. When the emperor left Elba, this young child followed his retinue. The 100 days took place. A small sum was given him to learn a trade, and the little Elban goat herd got married and is well settled in Paris. The emperor also went to Pianosa, a small island attached to Elba, where he was having a fort constructed under the supervision of Captain Larrabit, an engineering officer, later a deputy. He camped there several days in his tents, then returned to Portofrejo after quieting a rather violent altercation between a young captain and Major Rule, ADC, to the emperor. It was at about this time that notices from London informed Napoleon that the plan was to take him away from Elba did not originate with the British minister. Lord Liverpool had in fact written to Wellington in this regard. The Princess of Wales had just asked His Majesty if she could come to Elba. The emperor, deeply involved with construction and workmen, could not receive her graciously and asked her to put off this trip. The princess had seen Empress Marie-Louise in Bern during her trip to Switzerland. He learned she was being noticed there for the strangeness of her dress and behavior. In early December, the emperor sent the brig to Naples carrying Monsieur Ramolino. As official representative to the king, it was through the Queen and her ambassador, the Duke of Campo-Chiaro, that he had contact with Vienna. They were trying to bypass the Neapolitan ministers. They had their own court interests to defend at the Congress. the confinement of the King of Saxony and the occupation of Dresden, and Leipzig by Prince Repnine as Governor General served to separate the interests of the courts of Austria and France from those of Russia and Prussia. It was obvious that the cards were being reshuffled. It was then in Vienna, a time of anxiety and alarm. In Elba, it was not the moment to complain of the non-execution of the Fontainebleau Treaty. Later, the emperor learned that the Congress had been about to dissolve. An alliance was being formed between France, Austria, and England against Russia and Prussia, and the House of Bourbon was asking Austria for full reinstatement to the Naples and Parma branches of their holdings. Emperor Francis was already agreeing to violate the Fontainebleau Treaty articles that ensured Marie-Louise and her son the duchies of Parma and Plaisance. Returning from Naples, the brig almost sank on arrival. It was too late to enter the harbor. Captain Tayada waited until the next day. During the night, a terrible storm came up. Very early in the morning, a muffled sound was heard. It was cannon shots of distress. The weather was so bad that it was impossible to see or launch anything. The emperor was in bed. I entered his room and informed him of the condition of the sea and the help being called for. He immediately donned his robe and wanted to go out to his garden terrace. He was almost knocked over by the wind when he stepped out, and we reached the terrace wall with difficulty, holding on to it so as not to be blown away. His Majesty could only hear the muffled sound of the cannon, which he judged to be coming from the Étoile fort, but he could see nothing. The waves were furiously breaking on the rocks below the terrace, covering it with water and creating a spray that prevented seeing anything. The violence of the wind had knocked down the sentry boxes located near the palace. He had barely returned inside when General Drouot came to tell him it was his brig, the Inconstant, calling for help, and that it was barely holding on with only one anchor. It was feared the anchor would slip and the ship would break up, and it would have done so, save for the presence of mind of Lieutenant Jarry. At an instant when the storm-tossed vessel had its bow pointed towards a small nearby cove and the waves were pushing the ship toward it, this intrepid sailor cut the cable with a single axe blow and allowed the ship to beach itself. The emperor, alarmed over his sailor's peril, called for horses while he was dressing and galloped off, arriving near the cove where the brig had just beached itself with only little damage. The sailors were exhausted. Monsieur Ramolino was put ashore, where he fell to the ground, thanking Providence for saving him from such great peril. His Majesty ordered a large fire lit and all the provisions that could be found locally brought out. He returned to the palace happy that the brig's crew and the brig itself had been saved. On New Year's Day, the emperor accepted the good wishes of the island officials and the assembled officers' corps. He received a letter from the empress giving news of his son. She wrote that he was charming and would soon be able to write by himself. His Majesty also received letters from Prince Eugène, Queen Hortense, and other members of his family. The King of Naples assured him of his gratitude and complete devotion. Countess Bertrand, long kept at home by ill health, came for the occasion, and there was no end to the graciousness extended to her by the emperor. All these people, after being received by the emperor, then went to see Madame and Princess Pauline. That evening, there was a family dinner party to which were invited Grand Marshal and Countess Bertrand, General Drouot, General Cambron, Colonel Mallet, commanding the National Guard, the mayor of the city, Colonel Yermanovsky, the president of the court, Grand Vicar Arrighi, Chamberlains Ventini and Seno, Madame Ventini and her daughter, and Monsieur and Madame Pont de Hero. In the evening, there was a social gathering lasting until midnight, attended by many city residents and officers from the various corps. At 10 p.m., the emperor retired to his own quarters. In the morning, on his awakening, I presented my respects to the emperor, who asked me what I was giving him as a New Year's gift. I replied that I knew nothing worthy of him and could only wish to see him reunited with the Empress and the King of Rome. Poor child, he said as he got up. He then proceeded to wash and dress. The princess and Madame came to see the emperor at a moment when they were alone. They called for me, gracefully accepted my respects, and each gave me an opal of equal value. Through his secret correspondence, the emperor knew about the small rivalries existing in the empress's household between Madame de Montesquieu, who was said to be too great a lady to be worried by the harassment of the new lady-in-waiting, and Madame de Brignoli. According to such news, doubts were being cast in the empress's mind about the legitimacy of her marriage to the emperor, to push her into a divorce which she was vigorously resisting. The new lady-in-waiting was no foreigner to these intrigues. Rumors of removal from Elba and confinement on St. Helena continued to be given credence. As to the divorce, the emperor merely laughed, knowing only too well did Louise's attachment to himself and their son. He never doubted her having courageously declared she wished to keep her title as his wife. The Emperor of Austria was too religious not to firmly oppose the idea. All the circumstances of my divorce were known in Vienna before Marie-Louise got married. It was legal, valid, and unchallengeable. All these rumors are therefore without foundation. All this harassment and plotting will fail. They do not worry me in the least. I was thankful to Countess de Brignoli for accompanying the Empress to Vienna, and she would drop in my esteem were I certain that such advice came from her. In 1809, when the Emperor was to marry Archduchess Marie-Louise, the Vienna court had wanted to know all the circumstances of the divorce, the dissolution of his marriage with Josephine. The civil bond was a public act pronounced with all the solemnity required by our laws and the Senatus Consultum of the imperial family records. Vienna was provided with the official court decision stating there had been no marriage between His Majesty and Josephine. The official court had based its decision on the fact that the Council of Trent, our own traditions, and especially our royal ordinances to compensate for this council not having been recognized in France, demanded the presence of the contracting parties' own parish priests under penalty of annulment. This had not happened. The emperor was far from wanting to use a means that could only injure his dignity. In 1804, the court was at Fontainebleau. The Pope was coming for the imperial anointing. The marriage with Empress Josephine had not been blessed by the church. The empress was pressing the emperor to have this done. For it to be made public would have caused a scandal. Cardinal Fesch offered to perform the ceremony privately in the castle chapel, claiming to substitute for the actual parish priest, as did several cardinals. In his capacity as Grand Chaplain, he considered himself the court parish priest. He did indeed bless the marriage in the chapel in the presence of the Grand Marshal Duroc and 2 or 3 other witnesses. All he had done was totally null and void. The official court, after hearing the witnesses, declared it so, and fined the emperor 20,000 francs because of his imperial position. The fine was passed on to Cardinal Fesch for payment, so that he would learn about the Council of Trent and the Blois and Moulins ordinances. He certainly would not have been foolish enough to pay it, he said. Chapter 6. The news from France was becoming worse from day to day, and the dissatisfaction was general. In Vienna, plans were made to abduct the emperor and restrict his freedom. The first day of a faction's triumph is a day of happiness. All is clemency. Amnesty is on every tongue, even in every heart. On the second day, justice is invoked. There is a pretense of reasonable conduct. The third day is already that of vengeance and reactionary deeds. Who is asking for this? As always, those who had contributed neither a drop of blood nor a penny to victory. It was now the third day. Those who had acquired national property were being harassed. The army was ignored and insulted, and the marshal of that same army proposed a Quiberon commemorative column. The exile mentality present in all government acts was spoiling all the good the revolution had accomplished. The emperor groaned over this fine France he had labeled a great nation 20 years before. The thought of returning to France was taking root in his mind. For the past 8 months, the emperor's days had been spent in the midst of construction and of his family. As San Martino was completed and finished, the emperor was able to spend a few days there. Madame and Princess Pauline came for dinner. The princess, whose apartment was ready, settled there, accompanied by Madame Bellini, her lady companion. For a few days later, the emperor returned to Portofrejo for the approaching winter that came early that year. Soirees were held at the princesses, a few balls were given in town, the officers had their own, and all were most successful and well attended. The princess gave one that outshone all others. In the large ballroom built close to the palace, she and the many guests enjoyed it greatly, and the emperor came. At midnight he went home. The ball continued until daybreak. These festivities were at great expense to the town inhabitants, who had been invited. On January 8th, it snowed so much in Porto Ferrajo that no one could recall a similar thing happening before. Just as General Bonaparte had been credited with the abundant rain that fell during his stay in Cairo, some wanted to see something mysterious about the snow that fell in Porto Ferrajo and attributed to the emperor's presence on the island. In the midst of all these pleasures, the emperor became certain that Louis XVIII did not want to comply with the Fontainebleau Treaty and regarded the Republic and the imperial dynasty as usurpers. With secret joy, he observed that the mighty of the day, themselves insulted by the many libelous pamphlets then flooding Europe that showed the emperor as a coward, or some French Nero or Caligula, considered him a man in need of protection rather than a source of concern. These false notions led to the powers maintaining no agent in Porto Ferrajo. Only England ordered Colonel Campbell to divide his time among Florence, Livorno, and Piombino. The emperor knew and stated that outside of a few thousand schemers, the entire nation remained attached to him in spirit, opinion, and heart, just as it was attached to the principles of national sovereignty and French honor, that it had only submitted to the necessity imposed by its enemy and the new Judas, but that out of 30 million inhabitants, 29.5 million kept alive in their hearts the hope of overthrowing the princes, who were but enemies of the nation and foreign proxies. He knew that if ladies with embroidered lace handkerchiefs had called out, "Long live the king," when the guard entered Paris, the people were moved on seeing them and cried out, "Long live the old guard." The thought he had of returning to France and the bad weather caused him to suspend all construction except for roads, where it continued to provide work for the idle hands that would have had to be helped in some other fashion. His activities became more internal. He waited in silence for the moment when the public spirit in France reached the pitch where it would hail his return with acclamations. Such was the emperor's frame of mind when Monsieur Fleury de Chabouillon, a former auditor in the state, arrived in Elba. He was sent by a few of the emperor's friends to bring him an accurate report on French public opinion, beyond what he could gather from newspapers. He had 2 long meetings with the emperor, after which he departed for Naples. Napoleon's friends in France wanted him to know that the people were dissatisfied and that a movement aimed at overthrowing the government was taking shape. In favor of whom? The Duke of Orleans was being named. Fouché pointed to the core of this plot that offered Europe, said the emperor, the sad example of a king being overthrown by his own cousin. All these reports strengthened in the emperor's mind a resolve nurtured by his imagination, that of crossing over to France with the small number of troops he had available and striking the soil of France with his foot as Caesar had done, producing armed legions. Everything said in front of me caused me to believe that the emperor, in leaving Elba, with the Congress disbanded, was almost certain to win the Emperor of Austria to his cause. Nevertheless, in leaving Elba, much would be left to chance. The moment to attempt such an expedition seemed to have been reached. For 8 months, all expenditures had been drawn on the funds brought from Fontainebleau by Monsieur Pérouse. Madame and the princess had paid into that fund the monies they had with them, and I preserved intact the 800,000 francs in gold of his private purse. France was refusing to carry out the treaty of April 11th. This was not the time to complain, but to profit from it. The emperor had in his guard a Captain Haureau de Sorbet, whose wife was a reader to the empress and was with her. This officer left Elba with verbal instructions, which were successful, and he returned during the 100 days to bring news of the Empress and the King of Rome. He took part in the Battle of Waterloo as a battalion commander. For some days, the emperor was silent and thoughtful at home. Generals Bertrand and Drouot were summoned much more frequently than usual, as was General Cambron. And the map of France remained spread out in the study. Pins were stuck in it